For more on the global implications of invasive species, I want to bring in Margaret O'Gorman. She's the president of the Wildlife Habitat Council and the author of a forthcoming book called Strategic Corporate Conservation Planning. Margaret, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
People talk about conservation, they automatically think it means saving species. It's the instinct that I would have. How do you balance that with invasive species and the nuisance and perhaps costly burden that they have? How do you balance that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because listening to the earlier segment where the people in Florida were saying to kill the iguanas sounds like a really negative thing from a conservation management point of view, but when they're having such an impact on both the infrastructure in Florida and people's quality of lives, something certainly has to be done. And I think eradication of invasive species is one of the most effective ways that we have to deal with these, especially in the early days of an invasion when the number of species is not that large and they can actually be eradicated quite quickly. But usually they get to a stage like the iguanas and the pythons where it takes a lot of effort to deal with them.
Most people don't even know that this is a problem. How is the average person affected by invasive species in a way that they might not actually know?
Well, an interesting story around an invasive species that is affecting really a very American tradition, a very American concern, is the emerald ash borer. The emerald ash borer is devastating the ash trees across the US, and the ash tree is what makes the baseball bat. So as ash trees begin to die off, the availability of wood for an iconic American item is not going to be there anymore, and people will notice that.
It's fascinating. Species, as we know, have been invading areas since people started moving freely. Is what we're seeing more of the same, or are there environmental or perhaps climate forces that are exacerbating the problem?
Yes, I mean, that's very much the case. Species have been invading since the movement of goods and people around the globe. And as the movement of goods and people have become more efficient, there's been more species moving. We have seen invasive species that started in the US, in the 18 and 1900s as cargoes were moved around on ships. But today, climate change is exacerbating that issue, because the types of species that tend to be invasives are also the types of species that will also benefit from the disturbance of climate change. And by that I mean the invasive species have broad environmental abilities to adapt, and they also will adapt in more disturbed locations, both of which are caused by climate change. So we will certainly see that climate change will have an impact on invasive species' ability to become more prevalent in the future.
Why is this such a costly problem, and more so is the burden of cost proportionally carried by different sectors of society?
Well, I'm not an economist, so I'm not sure that I can address that, but the emerald ash borer, for example, that I talked about earlier, that is a $10 billion cost to the industry. To replace the amount of ash trees that are going to be taken out by the emerald ash borer will cost $10 billion. But it also has an impact on the carbon sequestration of those trees, which is an important part, again, of mitigating climate change. If we look at the Asian carp invasion up in the Great Lakes, that is impacting a commercial fishery that is, in the billions of dollars of commercial and recreational fishing, where the Asian carp is basically competing with native species for food. So the cost is going to be borne by those industries that use those resources. And I think government has a role to play to support those efforts and to support the efforts to eradicate these species.
You said government has a role to play. How serious is the international community taking this problem, and who are the most serious players?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in the US Department of Agriculture has been an amazing force, a very strong force in the past, looking at invasive species and the impacts that they're having on the agricultural community. They have done an awful lot of research. They do a lot of work to help farmers understand the species that may be attacking them, foresters, et cetera, et cetera. So the USDA has been very good. Countries like New Zealand and Australia also have seen to be at the forefront of many of these issues.
Margaret O'Gorman from the Wildlife Habitat Council, thank you so much for joining us.